Hello, welcome to Writing Quest. In this episode, we're going to talk about Stormlight Book 3, Oathbringer. We're going to give you 5 things I didn't like, and I'm going to give you 5 things I did like. Here we go. Huzzah! All right, so let's start in general. There's going to be a spoiler-free review, so don't worry about that. In general, I love this book. I've loved all of these Stormlight books. They've all been super great. I love how Brandon Sanderson just weaves this huge story over, like, there's so many chapters and there's so much good stuff in there, and he has great character development for a lot of people. I will say, generally, I didn't like this one as much as Words of Radiance, which is book 2. Words of Radiance still remains my favorite for sure. As far as books 1 and 3, I'm not really sure. I haven't decided exactly how I feel about if I liked book 1 or book 3 better. I'm kind of in the middle of that. But I loved this one a lot. As always, I loved all of them so far. I'm a big fan of Brandon Sanderson, as you know. And so let's get into it. We're going to start with the 5 things I didn't like, and then I'm going to jump into the 5 things I did like. So here we go. Number 1, there's so much to know, and it's not always explained well, I believe. This one was the hardest book for me to follow, so I really struggled. Like, I got lost a lot. I forgot what was going on, and I like that sometimes it would just transition to something, and a lot of things happen off camera, so I didn't really this one was just the hardest one for me to follow. So the first one was tough for me to follow a little bit because it was my introduction to the world, and so I really struggled with sometimes knowing who was talking, and there was a lot of characters and so many things to know. But by the time I got to book 2, I felt good. I was not too bad to follow. Obviously, there's a lot of things, and if it takes you a long time to read it, sometimes you forget what happens in the beginning before you get to the end. But this one in particular, I don't know if it was just the prose, or I don't know exactly what was going on, but for some reason, I just struggled to follow along with everything that was going on. Number 2, so the expansion of the magic didn't always make sense to me, and this could be tied to the first one where I was just struggling to follow along. Maybe I missed a few things at certain points earlier in the book, and then when it got to the end, I was struggling with it. But there's a lot of expansion to magical elements and learning more things about how different parts of, like, the enemy works and the good guys work and the Knights Radiant and all that kind of stuff. And so I struggled kind of understanding how it all happened. Maybe it was explained and I just missed it, but following some of the magical elements, really, they just kind of he went into some things and they were just kind of happening. And then I found myself kind of going back and being like, wait, what just happened there? So kind of an extension of the first one where I was just kind of lost in general a lot of the time. But the magical elements in particular, I sometimes just was struggling to keep up with. Number 3, the little vignettes about side characters were fine. So in this book, you get a lot of little vignettes about some of the characters from Bridge 4. And it was great to learn those things, but sometimes they kind of came out of nowhere. So, like, you have no chapter about a character, and then it pops up that there's a whole chapter that's just this one character. And it was fine to learn that stuff, but ultimately it didn't seem like it totally tied in by the time I finished the book. And so it was kind of just like, okay, like it didn't feel like a wasted time. That's the wrong way to put it. That's maybe too harsh, but it just felt like a detour that was unnecessary. I would have much more preferred if maybe he would have taken some of those side characters from Bridge 4 or whatever and made them more of a central theme. So there's a few of them that are like that, but then there was a few scenes that were just about a random Bridge 4 character that I don't know. I didn't really care much about it. Like, it was kind of nice to learn some things about the characters, but ultimately it didn't seem to me like it served the story in that great of a way. Number 4, the pacing can be very slow. And this is, I try to keep away from as many reviews and spoilers for something until I've finished it. But I did see this a couple of times where this seems to be the biggest complaint about Oathbringer is that it's definitely a slower paced book. And for sure, I felt that. I definitely was there's a couple parts where I'm like, okay, this is kind of what's going on here? When are we going to get to? It was a little monotonous in parts. And part of that ties into some of the prose that I'm going to talk about, some of my favorite things about it. But it also lended itself to being slow, and sometimes I found myself not as interested in reading the story. So obviously, when you jump into a big fantasy series like this, you're signing up for some of that stuff. There's just naturally going to be some slower parts that are less interesting because there's so many things going on. But in this particular book, I really felt it, whereas the previous books, I didn't feel that as much. Number 5, the conclusion was very messy and I found myself getting lost. Once again, going back to the first one, I found myself getting very lost with this story, and the conclusion really took that to a whole new level. I barely followed along. I had to go back and reread a lot of stuff, because I just really struggled with. There's so many characters and fighting and things happening, and like the prose is really quick and it changes all the time. And I definitely got lost multiple times. So the final conclusion of the whole thing is definitely kind of intense to get through. And I'm definitely going to spend some time doing some research on the back end of like reading some summaries and things like that to kind of figure out exactly what happened in all of that. All right, let's get to the 5 things that I loved about this. Number 1, I loved getting away from the Shattered Plains and exploring new parts of Roshar. I think this is probably the biggest feature of the book, in that you really we spent 2 huge books being on the Shattered Plains and dealing with the Shattered Plains situation. So this one, you finally get more, like you're going to more places, they travel a lot more, you see a lot more different societies, and you actually talk to characters from those societies, as opposed to things being, just talking about it in general. But like this particular book, I love the world expansion where you actually get to experience more of these different cultures that he's created. Number 2, the political intrigue. This one's definitely closer to a little bit more of a political thriller than the other 2. There's been a lot of politics in the other ones, but because in this one you're traveling to more places, you're seeing more things, there's a lot more characters in the whole political arena with different countries and nationalities. And so to me, that was really interesting. This one was definitely had a lot more political thriller elements than the other 2 had. And so I really loved all the political stuff and the kind of backstabbing and this and maneuvering, and everyone's trying to kind of do what they want, the right thing for their own country. And so just seeing how all the characters react to that was just really cool. I think it was done really well. Number 3, great action. This book has awesome action. The fight scenes are incredible. Everything is great. I love, and I thought this was Words of Radiance. Book 1 was fine, but Words of Radiance really upped up the action and the fighting and all that stuff as they learned more about their magic and stuff. This one, the fighting is just great. How he writes the action sequences and how it all happens is really cool. Minus when you get to the end, it does seem like it gets a little messy, but the actual fighting that he writes is really cool. So that was definitely a great part of it. Number 4, this is the book that finally starts really explaining things. So in book 2, if you've read that, you get a lot of explaining at the end of some things, a few revelations. This one wasn't so much about revelations and big surprises as it was just about explaining some things. So you get a lot more history of how things happened before Way of Kings and before that all happened. You get a lot of explanation about different characters, and it just really expands upon, it felt like we've had 2 books of like this building, and then we finally got one that really kind of let a little bit of the pressure off and explained some things, which probably contributes to one of the cons I said of it being slower. But ultimately, I'm really glad that it did some explaining. It kind of let some pressure off. And I'm sure by the time we get to book 4, it's just going to be, all sorts of crazy again. Number 5, Dalinar's backstory is so great. I love it. His backstory is great. How the book ends with him is great. Everything about his story, from his backstory to the present to everything that happens with Dalinar, is so cool. He's definitely my favorite character in the story for sure. Obviously, this book focused on him, so he's got it structured. So like book 1 focuses on Kaladin, book 2 focuses on Shallan, and this one focuses on Dalinar. And so his whole story is incredible. Everything about it is great. I loved every second of it, and it's just awesome. So definitely my favorite character of the series. And that's it for this review of Oathbringer, which is book 3 of the Stormlight Archive. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this, put some comments below, like the video, share and subscribe. Let's talk about it. If you have any thoughts of your own about it, let's make sure to keep it spoiler free. But if you have some thoughts, let's talk in the comments and let me know. So thanks for watching this episode of Writing Quest. We'll see you next time. Huzzah!